Sur les journalistes, bien évidemment, mais aussi sur tout ce qui est contre-pouvoir, tout ce qui est justice, notamment. Par exemple, le barreau d'Istanbul a été dissous hier. Il y a une volonté de reprise en main, c'est très très clair.
Vous avez parlé de la ville d'Istanbul. On rappelle que c'est une ville tentaculaire de près de 16 millions d'habitants. D'où cette question, est-ce que c'est une révolte ou est-ce qu'on est sur une révolution? Est-ce qu'on est en train de renverser la table? Est-ce que finalement la rue peut faire bouger le président Erdogan?
C'est les prochains jours qui vont nous le dire. Ce qui est certain, c'est que pour l'instant, il y a chaque jour plus de manifestants. Et non seulement à Istanbul, mais également dans quelques-unes des principales villes du pays, à Ankara, à Izmir par exemple, et même par exemple à Konya, c'est-à-dire du côté plutôt favorable à Erdogan et à l'AKP. Certes, mais encore une fois, Erdogan bénéficie de l'appareil d'État, de l'appareil policier, mais également de militants de l'AKP qui, eux, sont très très engagés derrière le président. Donc on va dire qu'on est à un moment où tout est possible, tous les scénarios sont possibles. Et vous savez, si les gens sont aussi prêts à manifester, c'est parce qu'il y a une crainte. Erdogan, normalement, son dernier mandat s'arrête en 2028 et il n'a plus le droit de se représenter. Oui, mais s'il modifiait la Constitution, comme l'ont fait avant lui, par exemple, Vladimir Poutine en Russie, eh bien, il se retrouverait président à vie. Et c'est aussi ça que veulent empêcher les manifestants.
Effectivement, 12, c'est donc 5 nuits, en l'occurrence, de mobilisation. Hier, c'était la 5e mobilisation massive, comme vous le voyez de nouveau sur ces images en Turquie, donc dans plusieurs villes, pas seulement dans la capitale, vous avez parlé de
dans la principale ville d'Istanbul,
mais aussi à Istanbul, en l'occurrence. Merci à vous, Alban Mikosi, pour ces précisions. On vous retrouve tout à l'heure sur un sujet que vous maîtrisez également, sur l'Ukraine, la situation en Ukraine et ces négociations qui ont lieu aujourd'hui même à Riyad, en Arabie Saoudite, entre les Russes et les Américains. On continue de parler de l'actualité internationale et elle nous emmène aussi à Gaza tout de suite. Gaza sous les raids israéliens. C'est le journal du Monde préparé par nos confrères de France 24.
Nouvelle frappe israélienne dans le sud de la bande de Gaza, quelques jours après avoir rompu le cessez-le-feu avec le Hamas. Cette fois, c'est l'hôpital Nasser qui est visé. Le service des urgences est complètement détruit.
Ce missile a touché le service de chirurgie, causant la destruction complète de la section. 90% des patients ont été transférés en Gaza et il y a eu des morts et des blessés à cet endroit.
Israël affirme avoir ciblé un membre du bureau politique du Hamas qui était soigné depuis plusieurs jours dans l'hôpital. Pour les Gazaouis, rien ne justifie de tels bombardements.
Les forces d'occupation israéliennes ont violé toutes les normes et toutes les lois internationales et humanitaires en prenant pour cible le service de chirurgie du complexe médical Nasser.
Depuis la reprise des frappes israéliennes le 18 mars, au moins 673 Palestiniens ont été tués dans la bande de Gaza, selon le ministère de la Santé du Hamas. Dans ce village proche de la ligne de front, un missile a frappé la maison de cette famille il y a 2 jours. Et maintenant, c'est un drone de combat qui survole la zone.
Allons-y, il faut se mettre à l'abri. Regarde, voilà ce qu'ils font ici.
Ludmila et sa famille traversent les décombres pour se cacher. Toute personne repérée par un drone peut devenir une cible. Depuis 5 mois, le village est sous le feu et les troupes russes se rapprochent.
Ça va, on peut souffler un peu. Il est parti plus loin.
Pour moi, tant qu'ils arrêtent de tirer, c'est suffisant. Que les gens cessent de mourir et que nos maisons restent debout. D'abord une trêve, peut-être ensuite un vrai cessez-le-feu. Cet accord sur les minerais, ça ne me concerne pas. Je n'ai jamais rien reçu de toute façon. Les gens ordinaires ne reçoivent rien.
Les rues sont quasi désertes. Seuls des véhicules militaires traversent à vive allure. Il ne reste que quelques habitants. Épuisés, terrorisés, ils attendent désespérément une trêve. Les délégations ukrainiennes et russes sont en Arabie Saoudite pour négocier un éventuel cessez-le-feu sous l'égide de diplomates américains. Depuis des dizaines d'années, le Tchad est une terre d'accueil pour les Soudanais qui fuient la guerre. Certains réfugiés ne sont là que depuis quelques jours. D'autres vivent à Farchana depuis près de 20 ans. Avec le temps, le camp est devenu un village.
Je suis ici depuis 2006, dans ce camp. Au début, il n'y avait rien. Pas de soudure, pas de matériaux, même pas d'électricité. J'étais obligé de louer un groupe électrogène pour commencer ce travail et faciliter la vie des habitants.
Plus de 800 000 Soudanais sont réfugiés au Tchad depuis le retour de la guerre civile en 2023. Un poids démographique et économique que le Tchad n'a plus les moyens d'assumer.
Les capacités des infrastructures d'accueil ont été initialement conçues pour un certain nombre de bénéficiaires pour une durée limitée. Et donc avec les nouveaux réfugiés, il y a saturation de ces installations.
Les ONG alertent sur la baisse de l'aide internationale dans la région, pourtant essentielle pour faire face à l'une des plus graves crises humanitaires au monde.
Vous êtes, comme moi, un lecteur ou une lectrice passionnée. Vous souhaitez vivre l'expérience des prix littéraires France Télévisions, dialoguer, échanger, peut-être même, qui sait, vous enflammer. Je vous propose de devenir membre du jury du prochain prix roman ou essai France Télévisions. Depuis toujours, c'est vous, lecteur, qui attribuez ces prix. Alors rejoignez-nous. Déposez votre candidature sur le site france-tv-et-vous.fr. Lisez bien.
C'est la suite du 14-16 sur France Info. Merci à tous de votre fidélité. On continue de parler de ce qui fait l'actualité cet après-midi. Eh bien, à 14h55, on parle de Gérard Depardieu. Il est arrivé il y a 1h30 maintenant au tribunal correctionnel de Paris. Il y est aujourd'hui et demain pour son procès qui avait été renvoyé à l'automne dernier en raison de l'état de santé de l'acteur de 76 ans. Il est accusé d'agression sexuelle par 2 femmes sur le tournage des Volets Verts en 2021. Il conteste les faits, comme l'a rappelé son avocat, Jérémy Assous, à leur arrivée au tribunal tout à l'heure.
On pourra démontrer de manière impartiale, objective et incontestable que l'ensemble des accusations sont mensongères. Ces actes, ces investigations, le parquet et les avocats des parties civiles ont tout fait pour qu'ils n'aient jamais lieu. Ils ont refusé de les réaliser. Nous les avons réalisés, nous les donnons au tribunal.
Il voulait cramer sa femme, ce sont ses termes. Mounir Bouta a comparé à partir d'aujourd'hui devant la cour d'assises de Gironde pour l'assassinat de son ex-femme, Shahinez Daoud, qu'il a brûlée vive dans la rue à Mérignac. C'était il y a 4 ans. Une affaire et de nombreux dysfonctionnements, de nombreuses défaillances. La victime avait porté plainte à 3 reprises l'année précédant sa mort. Ses parents ne s'en remettront évidemment jamais.
À côté de ma fille, je suis brûlée. À côté de Shahinez. Je ne peux pas oublier ma fille. Toujours, je pleure, toujours. Je ne peux pas oublier ma fille. Mais je bats pour mes petits-enfants.
N'importe quel être humain qui a un peu d'amour et un peu d'humanisme ne peut pas faire ces choses-là.
Emmanuel Macron a dénoncé le poison de l'antisémitisme.
Recommendations from member states, including 2 key recommendations from Ethiopia, which aimed at encouraging the government of Cote d'Ivoire to continue strengthening institutional and legal frameworks and to sustain and intensify its efforts in poverty reduction. Ethiopia encourages Cote d'Ivoire to take all necessary measures to fully implement the accepted recommendations with the aim of advancing human rights and improving the well-being of its citizens. In conclusion, Ethiopia fully supports the adoption of the UPR outcome of Cote d'Ivoire by the Human Rights Council and wishes the government of Cote d'Ivoire continued success in the implementations of these important recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Gabon.
Thank you, Vice President. My country welcomes the delegation of Cote d'Ivoire and thanks it for the additional information, which once more illustrates the authorities' commitment to ensuring the promotion and protection of human rights. Under actions undertaken, we could point to combating trafficking, exploitation and work laboured by children, as well as reforms in the judicial and penitentiary areas in order to improve access to justice, combat torture, and manage custody and detention under strict conditions. We welcome Cote d'Ivoire's dynamism in promoting and protecting human rights. We call on the Council to adopt the outcome document on Cote d'Ivoire and wish Cote d'Ivoire every success in implementing the recommendations ensuing from its most recent UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ghana welcomes the delegation of Côte d'Ivoire to the adoption of the Universal Periodic Review and commends them for successfully completing their review exercise under the 4th UPR cycle. We note with satisfaction Côte d'Ivoire's constructive engagement during the review and for showcasing a strong commitment to cooperate fully with the UPR mechanism. Ghana is delighted that the government of Côte d'Ivoire has committed to implement a total of 226 out of the 273 recommendations it received. This includes our 2 recommendations on the ratification of the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the strengthening of the prevention mechanisms to address drug use through community programs for young addicts. Mr. Vice President, in conclusion, my delegation fully supports the adoption of the UPR report of Côte d'Ivoire and wishes the government success in implementing the accepted recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Guinea.
Thank you. The delegation of Guinea would like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation of Côte d'Ivoire and welcome the efforts they're making to promote and protect human rights. We encourage the complete implementation of these recommendations, particularly in the area of economic and social rights. We encourage them to completely implement these recommendations to step up the protection of economic and social justice. By way of conclusion, we recommend the adoption of this report by the Council and support Côte d'Ivoire in its future measures to improve human rights. Many thanks.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished delegate of India.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. India welcomes the delegation of Côte d'Ivoire for the adoption of the report of the UPR Working Group on its 4th cycle of the Universal Periodic Review held on 5th November 2024. The review saw substantive participation with 98 delegations taking the floor and making a total of 273 recommendations. We appreciate the constructive engagement of the delegation of Côte d'Ivoire during the entire review, which reflects their commitment to the UPR process. India appreciates that as many as 226 recommendations have been accepted, including accepting 2 recommendations made by us. While recommending the adoption of their UPR report, we congratulate the delegation of Côte d'Ivoire on a successful review and wish them success in their efforts towards implementing the accepted recommendations. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished delegate of Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Monsieur le Vice-Président, ma délégation.
Thank you. My delegation would like to congratulate Côte d'Ivoire on the successful participation in the constructive dialogue of its 4th UPR cycle. We really commend the significant efforts made by Côte d'Ivoire to promote and protect fundamental human rights, in particular by advancing social and economic rights. We also welcome the improvement of access to public health care, including the adoption and implementation of its strategy plan for maternal and child health by providing a health insurance scheme for its citizens. My delegation is happy to see that Côte d'Ivoire has accepted the majority of recommendations received during the constructive dialogue, including the 2 recommendations made by Lao PDR. We wish Côte d'Ivoire every success in implementing the accepted recommendations. In conclusion, we encourage the Council to adopt the UPR outcome of Côte d'Ivoire by consensus. And I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Distinguished colleagues, this was the last speaker that we could accommodate. Let me remind you that all statements, including those which could not be delivered due to time constraints, should be uploaded online. I will now give the floor to the other stakeholders to make their general comments on the outcome. The speaking time has been set at 2 minutes for all. This first speaker on my list is International Federation of ACAT. You have the floor.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. We'd like to pay tribute to the commitments entered into, particularly regarding setting up a national mechanism to prevent torture and improving conditions of detention. Our organisations recall their support to Côte d'Ivoire to prevent torture in places of deprivation of liberty, combating prison overcrowding and improving detention conditions by setting up programmes to combat abusive pre-trial detention. However, ACAT and FIACAT are concerned about difficulties faced by civil society organisations to have access to penitentiary establishments and meeting detainees, despite Article 126 of Decree 5 April 2023, which provides for this. The absence of these visits means you can't have an independent follow-up of conditions of detention, depriving detainees of additional protection against torture and cruel and human degrading treatments. ACAT, Côte d'Ivoire and FIACAT would call on the authorities of Côte d'Ivoire to facilitate access to places of deprivation of liberty for those stakeholders that defend human rights, so that we can continue cooperation with the commitments entered into by the authorities during this review. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of International Service for Human Rights.
Monsieur le Vice President, ISHR and the UPR Monitoring Committee would like to congratulate Côte d'Ivoire for the fact that they accepted most of the recommendations made regarding protecting the rights of human rights defenders. Also, Ordinance 2024-368, which has to do with the organisation of civil society and strengthening the existing protection mechanism. Indeed, in March 2022, Côte d'Ivoire set up a national mechanism to protect human rights defenders, following on from the adoption on the 20th of June 2014 of the law promoting and protecting human rights defenders, making our country the first in Africa to adopt such a piece of legislation. However, we see that the makeup of the mechanism does not yet include the human rights defenders themselves, and we expect close cooperation with them. We also note the desire of the government to monitor the civil society organisations. There is an ordinance that has been passed regarding the organisation of civil society, which is now ready for ratification. These provisions can affect freedom of association and the principle of the independence of civil society organisations, particularly those regarding the dissolution of civil society organisation, criminalisation of the people responsible for the organisations, and other restrictions on fundamental freedoms. Hence, we'd call on the state to ensure that there is a legal framework where freedom of assembly is protected in line with the law regarding protection of human rights defenders and the international obligations of Côte d'Ivoire regarding human rights, and that they should set up a standing national body, an inclusive body made up of different stakeholders, in order to facilitate the following up and implementation of the UPR recommendations and those stemming from the treaty bodies. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to the representative of Civicus.
Thank you, Vice President. Civicus, the Ivorian Coalition of Human Rights Defenders and the West African Human Rights Defenders Network note the commitment of the Côte d'Ivoire government in the UPR process regarding the institutional reforms already engaged. Normatively, Côte d'Ivoire adopted Law 2022-978 of the 20th of December 2020, amending Law 2017-867 of 2017 regarding the press to guarantee free exercise of this for journalists. However, we need to relativise this because certain articles, such as 369 and 372 of the Criminal Code of June 2019, Indent 3 of Articles 214 and 225 of Law 2024-352 of the 6th of June 2024 considerably limits those areas of progress. We note Ordinance 2024-368 of the 12th of June 2024 regarding the organisation of civil society, passed by the President of the Republic, which has now gone to the plenary of our Parliament for ratification in March 2025, repealing Law 1960 on these associations, which to some extent clamps down on civil society organisations. There are measures that restrict freedom of association, particularly the competence given to the Cabinet regarding dissolution of these bodies in certain circumstances. However, we note that freedom of assembly is still a challenge because of restrictions on public freedoms. This is happening more and more often, and we're seeing this because there have been bans on demonstrations and mass arrests sometimes. Hence, we'd ask the government to create an enabling environment for civil society and for human rights defenders. As a point of honour, we need to bank on the preservation of the civic space in the future with a view to the elections.
Thank you.
We're listening here to the Human Rights Council holding a meeting. We do have to step away for our first commercial break of this hour. When we come back, we are seeing that the United Nations Security Council also just getting started on their discussion regarding some of these peacekeeping efforts. And then also a live now look over in Connecticut. We are expecting lawmakers and advocates to speak out against President Trump's executive order regarding the Department of Education. All this and more next. Welcome back. A live now look over in Connecticut as we are waiting for lawmakers down there to speak out against President Trump's executive order regarding the Department of Education, the dismantling of it. Expected to speak at this is the governor, Ded Lamont, as well as the lieutenant governor, and we'll also have a couple of senators and representatives. This is set to get started in about 5 minutes or so. While we wait for them to get set up and make those remarks at the microphone, this could be it. It could also be just a mic check. You can see Senator Blumenthal there stepping into the frame. It looks like it's going to get going. So let's bring up the audio for just a sec. Let's listen in to see how this is looking over there.
Pronounce my name. Real oh, well, you know.
So it looks like they're still getting set up here. You can see, though, lawmakers as well as advocates for education. They're going to be discussing how last week we did showcase to you the fact that President Trump signed an executive order to denounce the Department of Education, leaving all of those duties down to the state and local levels. They are getting started. Let's listen in.
Conference on the decision by the Trump administration to dismantle the Department of Education, something that is so incredibly personal for me. When I walked in this room this morning, my heart sank a little bit because this very room that chair right there is where I sat for my Teacher of the Year interview. And I say that not for an applause, but it never gets old, but because I believe so fundamentally in public education. It literally changed my life. And for all of the people who are talking about it's not the responsibility of government to educate our children, and there's different ways to do this, they don't understand what happens to the kids who don't have the opportunities that are available to them in public schools. There's so much to be said about the Department of Education, but what I'm realizing is that people really don't understand what the Department of Education does. The Department of Education does not handle local curriculum, instruction, instructional materials, instructional practices. Those things are already decided at the state and local level. So my question to everyone is, what exactly do you want returned to the states? The federal government will never write a check to any state or organization and say, do with it whatever you will. There will always be guidelines. There will always be federal input. What the Department of Education does is handle things like protection against discrimination, handles things like special education for our children, funds to Title I districts. In my district alone, almost $70 million came from the federal government. 53% of students who went to college used Pell Grants from Connecticut's 5th District. Without it, they would not have a chance. So when people say we want it returned to the states, are they saying states should have the right to discriminate if they choose? They should have the right to not fund schools in our poorest communities? States should have the right to not make sure that teachers have professional development and training. States should have the right to make those decisions? I disagree. Public education is a public good for our kids. I worry about the profession. I worry about young teachers who are aspiring and want to go into our most difficult communities and help our children. And we all have to push back against that. On Thursday, the day after a couple days after this order was announced, we introduced a resolution of inquiry in the House of Representatives, which means that the executive branch, the president, has 14 days to provide all of the factual documents as to why this decision was made and what the plans are going forward. As a teacher, I could never walk into an IEP meeting and say, don't worry about it, special education students will be taken care of. The law requires more of me, and you should require more of the President of the United States. So I just encourage everyone to learn the facts. Learn what the Department of Education does in your respective communities. Learn how much federal funding comes back to your district and what programs and services that pays for. Because two things will happen. The things that are mandated by law will remain in law, and districts will have to decide how they meet those legal obligations. Will they cut other services, or will they raise taxes? And without the enforcement mechanisms that the Department of Education provides, our children are at risk. The implications of this are astronomical. So I encourage you all, no matter what part of the state you live in, no matter what community you're from, no matter whether you have children in the schools or not, to ask the tough questions. What does this mean? What services will be cut? What does returning education mean, back to the states mean? What was taken away? I have yet to hear that answer. People think a blank check is coming from the Department of Education. Linda McMahon hasn't said that. Elon Musk hasn't said that. Donald Trump hasn't said that. Here in Connecticut, I know we are strong proponents of public education, but it's not just about the kids here. It's about all of the kids in this country. We all have a collective responsibility to our children. So again, thank you so much for coming, for filling the room, for sharing this message, for fighting hard for teachers, for students, for parents, for families, even if they're not your child. I am someone who I've said many, many times before, everything I learned about school, I learned at school. Everybody doesn't have the family to provide them with the support that they need to be successful. So if we are making a conscious choice to say only the kids who have strong advocates at home deserve a high-quality public education, that fundamentally changes who we are as a nation. I will never stop fighting for me and for those kids like me, because all they need is a shot, and I'm going to make sure they get it. And with that, our senior senator, and I'll just say, this has been all-consuming for me. My entire life has been built around education, public education. I was educated in public schools, went to community college, Connecticut State universities. All of my education was right here. And I remember, literally, when I think about all of the things that the Department of Education does, I remember being in the classroom after Sandy Hook and watching our senators fight so hard to bring federal education dollars back to the state of Connecticut for wraparound services, for trauma supports, for school construction, for all of the things that needed to happen. This is so much bigger than what happens in the classroom. It is about the implications for entire communities. Senator Blumenthal.
I'm so inspired and grateful to follow one of the great education leaders in the United States of America, Congresswoman Jehana Hayes. And to be here with steadfast champions of education. Connecticut should be proud of its leadership at the state level. All of your legislators, our constitutional officers, our great governor who has been so stalwart and steadfast. We know the importance of public education. We are not going to let this administration privatize it, turn it over to for-profit businesses and the profiteering loan sharks that all too often take advantage of our students. So let me come right to the point. Donald Trump and Linda McMahon and Elon Musk can't just dismantle the Department of Education because they feel like it. Congress created the Department of Education. Only Congress can destroy it in the way that Musk, Trump, and McMahon want to do. And I will tell you, I will promise you, we will deny them the votes to destroy our Department of Education. The United States Senate needs 60 votes. Republicans have only 53. I promise you, Democrats will stand against this effort to destroy American public education. We will be united, we will be strong, and we will have support from places like Connecticut, where we know the importance of public education and we're willing to fight for it. And I can tell you, I've talked to my colleagues. There's just no way that we are going to allow American public education to be denigrated and degraded on our watch. And that's what Elon Musk and Donald Trump want to do. Linda McMahon is just their puppet. She's taken the job to destroy American education, put herself out of a job, but we are not going to let them do it. And let's be clear about what the agenda is here. These false claims about savings, they're just trying to move money out of American education so that they can cut taxes for the billionaires. It's really simple, folks. They want to take the money that goes into Title I, the IDEA, civil rights enforcement, billions of dollars, save it so that they can cut taxes for billionaires, the ultra-wealthy, the millionaires. They need that bookkeeping. And they say they want to turn it over to the states, turn education over to the states. We know, as you stand here, the states already run American public education. What these federal programs do is provide places like Waterbury, Danbury, New Haven, Hartford, all the communities in Connecticut, billions of dollars, including rural communities, with what they need to provide that additional support. And what is the real life impact here? Today, in schools around Connecticut, 533,000 students in 1,000 schools receive magnificently more education because of those federal funds. In Waterbury, it's 22% of their education budget. It's a real life-changing difference for students who are in the classroom right now, for teachers whom we're trying to recruit and train, for boards of education who need it for programs that they sponsor. And let me say to the mayor of Danbury, Roberto Alves, who's here today, people in Danbury are going to pay higher property taxes if Elon Musk and Donald Trump succeed in dismantling the Department of Education. People in every community all around the country are going to pay higher property taxes. What they're trying to do is simply shift the burden from the federal government to local property taxpayers so they can cut taxes at the federal level. For Elon Musk and his fellow billionaires, it's a sham, it's a scam, it's a bait and switch. And Americans should be angry. I'm angry. And I can tell you, my fellow Democrats in the United States Senate are going to be angry, and we're going to vote that anger against an administration that wants to deprive our students of what they need and deserve to compete in today's world and excel as they should and make Connecticut proud. So we're going to continue this effort. I want to thank all of you for being here today. And just in case anybody needs an additional kind of footnote here, Linda McMahon said yesterday, she was interviewed on one of the talk shows, she has no problem with Robert Kennedy being responsible for administering all the vaccine programs that the Department of Education is responsible for doing. Robert F. Kennedy, the denier of vaccines' effectiveness, will be responsible for the vaccine requirements to make schools safe. Can you imagine anything more frightening and more inconsistent with the values that we espouse? Higher education, loans. They say they're going to be administered by the SBA, not the Department of Education. Who's going to be the quality checkers to prevent fraud in higher education loans? Well, the SBA is firing 63% of its staff. Department of Education is firing half of everybody who works there. We are seeing the decimation of public service as we know it, and it's a terrible lesson for our students. But we're going to stand strong against this administration, inspired by all of you who are here today. Thank you so much. I'm really proud to introduce our great governor. Thank you.
Yeah, you're right, Dick. We're mad as hell. We're not going to take it anymore. We're going to stand strong. We're going to stand strong, mobilizing parents, teachers, paras, students, what this means for our future, what this means for each and every one of our kids. And thankfully, we have Jahana Hayes leading the charge, not only in Connecticut, but down in Washington, D.C., the greatest champion public education and our kids and our teachers have, and every day fighting to make sure that we don't deprioritize education. It's just incredible in this day and age that the Trump administration wants to deprioritize education. Just as the rest of the world is doubling down, making the investments they need, just as important for us to be able to make sure we have the best trained, best most productive workers in the world. This is no time to say, let's deprioritize education. We're not going to let it happen here in Connecticut, and I'm sure that Jahana and Dick and our entire delegation aren't going to let it happen in Washington, D.C., but we need you. We need parents. We need teachers. We need everybody to stand up and say, this is what it means for our region. Look, this is $500 million plus this is what the impact would be if they just cut out the support we get from the Department of Education. Those go to some of our most underserved kids in some of our disadvantaged communities. That's probably 24, 25 million, say, to Waterbury alone. How do you make that up? A lot of this, the IDEA, goes to kids with special needs. These are special kids. They deserve that extra attention. That's how we make sure that everybody gets a fair start at the starting line of life. And that's what they're putting at risk right now. In all this herky-jerky policy stuff, it just puts an incredible cloud of anxiety over our amazing teachers who fight every day to make sure we have the best schools in the country right here in Connecticut. So that's why I'm really proud to be with each and every one of you. I want to make sure we stand tall for Connecticut. And by the way, call your friends in some of those red states, because they're going to get hammered as well. With that, let me just introduce Susan Beiswitz and then Beth Bai. Both of them know something about early childhood education. And by the way, Head Start would be at risk as well. Not going to let it happen.
Thank you.
We're listening here to several Connecticut lawmakers speaking out against the executive order issued last week by President Trump dismantling the Department of Education. We'll be right back.
Our kids in public schools. During the pandemic, the Biden administration put a program into place to allow farmers in every state across the country to provide food to kids, milk, fruit, vegetables, healthy food. That's at risk, and that is just catastrophic for our farmers in Connecticut and across the country, and for the 1 in 7 kids in our state that are hungry. So yes, it's about education, but it's also about feeding our kids and making sure that they have the nutrition they need so they can learn and do well on all of those standardized tests and be successful in school. So we're standing strong against these short-sighted, unconscionable, and catastrophic proposals. And it is my pleasure to introduce the person who is also in charge of the future of our youngest children, and that's Beth Bai, our great commissioner. Thank you.
First off, a big thank you to Congresswoman and Senator for bringing us together here today. There's a lot on your shoulders, and there are no two better people to be standing there for Connecticut as well as the rest of our delegation. In Connecticut, we talk a lot about March Madness. It's a big deal, right? This is March Madness that I am standing here before you today talking about the Department of Education being dismantled when it oversees birth to 3. We also talk a lot in this building about how business says we need predictability and reliability so we can plan. This president is bringing nothing but unpredictability and unreliability. And in early childhood, these parents are relying on us. If you have a baby with Down syndrome or you have a 3-year-old with autism, birth to 3 is your friend and your champion. I'm taking a chance here, but raise your hand if your family has benefited from birth to 3 services. Many, many. Right now in Connecticut, over the last 6 months, 7,000 children have gotten special education services from birth to 3, delivered in their homes or at their child care programs. Wherever that child and family need help, birth to 3 is there. That's we have about $6 million that we get a year from the Department of Education just for birth to 3, and another $13 million in Medicaid, and we've all heard about those Medicaid concerns. This is madness. On top of that, we get $2 million to train those birth to 3 providers to work with families, to provide the best speech therapy, the best physical therapy that those young children need. The fact that we're standing here today talking about dismantling the agency that supports our state in overseeing that is madness. Just a couple of other things for your information, and then I'll pass it off to our next speaker. But we, over the last 30 years, we've really depended on the feds. We call when we have a question, and guess what? If we're having a challenge with a family or a child with a particular disability, the Department of Education will put us in touch with another state to tell us how to best serve that family. They also help us live within the rules of the Individuals with Disability Act, a major, major piece of legislation that has opened doors for millions of families over the decades. So the madness has to stop. Our families need predictability and reliability. Our state needs predictability and reliability if we're going to serve families. So I just thank you for raising awareness. And we need birth to 3 to be strong, as well as our 3 to 5-year-old special education program. So I am turning it over to Dr. Jeffrey Solon from Cheshire Public Schools.
Thank you, Commissioner, and good morning, everyone. I'm before you today as an unregistered voter. I've spent 30 years dedicated...
Secretary of the State can fix that right now. Sorry.
Unaffiliated voter, excuse me. I am registered. Yeah, trust me. Going to school and being an educator has taught me the power of using my vote. And I've spent nearly 30 years dedicated to helping every student and family who walk through our schoolhouse doors as a public educator. The gutting of the Department of Education should give every American pause. The redistribution of public money away from public schools and toward private schools, religious institutions, and charter schools where there is a limited public accountability, often no requirement for teacher certification, and generally no requirement to provide special education services is deeply concerning. The justification for this argument is the decline in test scores since 2012. You can read The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt for another examination of failing test scores since 2012. There's been a precipitous decline in student performance in almost every country where children were introduced to unfettered access to social media at that time. Blaming public educators here is the equivalent of blaming doctors for obesity. Perhaps we should be listening to public educators rather than shunning them. Public education is and must remain a cornerstone of our democracy. While education is primarily a state and local responsibility, the federal government has historically played an essential role in protecting student rights, promoting access for all, and supporting critical programs for our most vulnerable learners. The prospect of weakening or eliminating that support is deeply concerning. Connecticut superintendents and teachers will continue to partner with the Connecticut State Department of Education to support each and every one of our students. Our families depend on it. Please welcome from Waterbury, Mirabel Rodriguez.
She's coming. The next speakers are parents, community members, grandparents, religious leaders, all people who will be impacted by this. But I think one other thing I wanted to say is Chapter 11 in Project 2025 outlines exactly what is happening right now. So for all of the people who are saying, don't worry, it'll be taken care of, we've seen chapter by chapter when it came to labor, when it came to environmental protections. And if you read through Chapter 11, it doesn't say we're going to continue to provide those services at the state level. It eliminates many of the services that we're talking about, and the next speakers can talk to the detrimental impact that will have on our communities.
As they transition between speakers here at this press conference, an event being held in Connecticut, we're going to use this opportunity to step away for another brief commercial break. We'll continue with more of your live events next. Welcome back to Live Now from Fox, where we are heading back out to Connecticut as we are seeing parents and advocates speak on President Trump's order to dismantle the Department of Education.
Breakfast to the children in school, I said, thank God. They deserve to have a hot meal because not everybody can have a hot meal at home. So I urge everyone to please, and Congress, to make sure that they put a stop to this and that every child in our country gets the quality education they deserve.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sean Mosley. Currently serve as a school administrator in Waterbury Public Schools. Waterbury Public Schools is a Title I district. I'm joined today by our interim superintendent, Dr. Darren Schwartz, other officials from our education department, our local and state delegation. And I'm here today because my heart is heavy. I'm standing with our Congresswoman, our federal delegation, our state delegation, state officials, local officials. I see there are teachers here, educational advocates. We're all standing in unison because our hearts are heavy. I'm hearing and seeing and reading that there are plans to dismantle our nation's Department of Education. I want you to hear me for a second again. There are plans to dismantle our nation's Department of Education. I wouldn't have imagined I'd be standing in a room in 2025 in the state of Connecticut, in the United States of America, talking about the dismantling of the Department of Education. I believe in this country. I believe in the United States of America. You tell a lot about a nation by how it treats and supports its most vulnerable population, including its children. I work in a Title I district. I taught in a Title I district. I'm an administrator in a Title I school. I graduated from a Title I high school. Every day I go to work, I'm working with students, teachers, other administrators, and families, and I'll say that again, families who need us, all of us, and who need the support of our boards of education, our state boards of education, but also our federal Department of Education. You see, when you dismantle something, that means you don't love it. You don't dismantle things you love. When you dismantle something, it means you don't care about it. It means you don't value it. We, everyone in this room and everyone watching, know that we care about our kids, we care about our communities, and we care about the quality of education in our districts, our state, and in our nation. The Department of Education holds states to standards, and standards are important. Standards help us, no matter if you live in Connecticut, California, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, North Dakota, no matter what state you live in this union, you are entitled and you will receive a top-notch, quality public education. Protections for students with disabilities, funding for students to go to college. Those are all values that we as Americans hold near and dear to our hearts. Dismantling the Department of Education would dismantle all of those programs, but it would dismantle the hopes and dreams of our families in our nation. I'm always going to ride or die for public education. I'm always going to stand with those who stand up for what's right, for our children, our families, and our communities. And I'm always going to be here, as you all are today, to speak up and to speak out. We can't let forces, no matter how great they may seem, destroy what we build. Yes, the 10th Amendment allows for states to control how education is administered. But it's Article 1 of the Constitution that charges our Congress to do what's best for the general welfare of our nation. And that includes educate and appropriate funds. And that includes doing what's right for our children. This is not a Democrat issue. This is not a Republican issue. This is not an independent issue. This is a people issue. This is a human issue. And we're going to fight for what's right, and we're going to fight together, and we're going to stand for the education of our kids, the education of our community, and the education in America. Thank you. At this time, I'm going to call up one of our faith leaders in the city of Waterbury, Pastor Antoine Richardson of the Zion Baptist Church.
Good morning to each of you. I'm not able to wax eloquent like Alderman Sean Mosley, so I brought in help. One of the greatest voices of our time, Whitney Houston, sung this song. I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Show them all the beauty they possess inside. Give them a sense of pride to make it easier. Let the children's laughter remind us how we used to be. Brothers and sisters, constituents of the state of Connecticut, my fellow Americans, I stand before you as a concerned citizen because I'm deeply concerned about the future of our children, especially those who have long depended on our nation's promise of equal opportunity for all those who live inside of the United States of America. President Trump's decision to dismantle the Department of Education is just not myopic, it's moral failure. I keep hearing the term illegal, how it is illegal for him as President of the United States of America to dismantle the Department of Education. But not only is it illegal, might I suggest to you, brothers and sisters, that it's downright irresponsible. It is the highest disregard for responsibility, and it comes from the highest office in the free world. It's abandonment of the government's most sacred duties, ensuring that every child, no matter their zip code, no matter their race, no matter what side of the tracks they come from, have equal access to education. The Department of Education, watch this, was never meant to be weaponized as a political tool. It was created to be a safeguard for people who do not have the access and privilege that others do not have. Let's be clear, we all know who bear the weight of this decision. It's not the wealthy families who can afford private schools or hire private tutors. It's not the privileged who have the options and resources to access to higher education. It is the impoverished students in rural America and in the inner cities. It is the children whose family who have disabilities and rely on federally enforced protections to get a fair chance. It is the families who depend on Title I funding to keep their underfunded schools afloat. It is students who, like me, once relied on Pell Grants to have a fair chance at higher education. By dismantling the president, we should dismantle the president, that's what I should say. By dismantling the Department of Education, brothers and sisters, President Trump has turned his back on the idea that education is a public good and a shared responsibility. This isn't just bad policy, it's ultimate betrayal. Leadership means standing up for those who cannot stand for themselves. It means recognizing that the strength of this country lies not in leaving each state or school district to fend for itself, but in ensuring that every child has a fair shot at success. Today, we call for accountability. We call for compassion, and we call for renewed commitment to our children's future. America, it used to be said, united we stand, divided we fall. In the days of Trump, for the next 4 years, those words have taken on a more nefarious tone because those words now have to be reversed. America, divided we stand, and united we ultimately will fall. And my prayer is that God will bless America. And if God can't bless America, at least God will keep America for the remainder of these next 4 years. Thank you. We now call on Jonathan Costa.
We're listening here as several advocates, parents, lawmakers down there in Connecticut continue to discuss that latest executive order issued by President Trump just last week to dismantle the Department of Education. But now we do want to turn to some breaking news still considering the Trump administration. Take a look at this with the Associated Press now saying that the Trump administration is asking the Supreme Court to halt a ruling ordering the rehiring of thousands of federal workers let go in mass firings across several agencies. In an emergency appeal filed today, that's Monday, the Republican administration argued the ruling should be put on hold because the judge didn't have the authority to order some 16,000 probationary employees to be hired back. The order came from U.S. District Judge Williams Alsup in San Francisco, who found the firings didn't follow federal law and required immediate offers of reinstatement be sent. The agencies include the Departments of Veteran Affairs, Agriculture, Defense, Energy, the Interior, and the Treasury. I do want to bring us out to this live picture that we have over at the White House because we do continue to follow all of these breaking news updates regarding the Trump administration and several of these initiatives that have been brought forth by President Trump. A little more background on That ruling, it was handed down, as I said, by 2 federal judges requiring that President Trump's administration rehire thousands, if not tens of thousands, of probationary workers that were let go in those mass firings. Both judges separately found legal problems with the way the mass terminations were carried out and ordered the employees at least temporarily be brought back on the job. The Trump administration, again, already appealing the first ruling, the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt cast it as an attempt to encroach on the president's power to hire and fire employees, saying, quote, the Trump administration will immediately fight back against this absurd and unconstitutional order. And that is what we're seeing now, as the Associated Press officially confirming that the Trump admin is asking the Supreme Court to halt that ruling that orders the rehiring of thousands of federal workers who were fired from several agencies. We're stepping away for our final commercial break of this hour. We'll be back with more of your top stories and breaking news headlines next.
Welcome back, everyone, to Live Now from Fox Worldwide, here for you as we continue to bring you top stories, headlines on this Monday edition. Live look at the White House as we are awaiting President Trump remarks. Going to be happening around 2 p.m. Eastern. Of course, we will have that for you in full as always. Hi, everyone. Mike Pace here. Thanks again for joining us on this Monday edition where we bring you top stories, live feeds from all over the country. And of course, when breaking news happens, we've got you covered. Let's go back out to Connecticut. It looks like the tail end right now of Connecticut officials discussing the future of the Department of Education. Let's listen in.
Because we haven't talked about the teachers of Connecticut. You know, people often say to me, I'm probably to others in public, boy, you have a tough job. I'll tell you who has a tough job. Teachers have a tough job. And this, you know, at the most basic level, this illegal effort is not just against the law, it's immoral, it's a gut punch against students, but it's also a punch in the face to teachers around America. People we should be elevating and acclaiming and really valuing and training for their work. And Donald Trump is basically giving them the middle finger. You know, Donald Trump and Elon Musk are giving teachers the middle finger. And it is illegal, it's immoral. We're not going to let it happen.
I've also heard people talk about, to your point, Senator, this money coming back from the federal government can raise teacher salaries. We have legislation to raise teacher salaries that my Republican colleagues have rejected and voted against time and time again. That's not what this is. So I really need for people to understand, this does not mean that the $500 million that the state of Connecticut received from the Department of Education last year will be appropriated next year, and districts and the state can do with it whatever they please. It means we are at risk of not receiving those funds and having to figure out what happens next. When you talk about priorities, your budgets are a statement of your priorities and your values. And what is happening right now is showing that we do not value public education.
I think the governor has said a couple of times that right now it comes at a difficult time because states are putting their budgets together, right? So there's money that has to be accounted for, and if there's a shortfall somewhere else, other states have to be filling this as well, though.
But that's why this is so irresponsible. Anyone who literally, the fiscal year in a school, by June, you're planning for next year. So for Linda McMahon to make that announcement and the president to sign the executive order with no plan about what happens next is beyond irresponsible. This taking a chainsaw to the Department of Education without reading the fine print. As a teacher, I could never walk into an IEP meeting and say, don't worry, our special education students will be well taken care of. The law requires more from me as a teacher. So as districts are planning for next year, for her to not have a detailed plan, which is why, again, we introduced this resolution of inquiry, because we need a fact-finding, all the memos, the emails, all of the information that you're using to make these decisions, and then what does that look like going forward? I don't know about anybody else in this room, but I'm going to need a little bit more than Robert F. Kennedy's word that he's going to make sure that students with special needs are cared for and have everything that they need.
One of the things that I recently heard from President Trump was that with students with special needs, they wouldn't fall under the Department of Education.
It would be HHS.
They'd be somewhere else. Where is somewhere else, and how does that sit with you?
Why aren't people asking that question? Where is somewhere else? Even as the president, you don't get to just say, we're going to put these students somewhere else. Because for parents, a parent's one responsibility is their child. For educators and leaders, our responsibility is everybody's children, everybody's child. So I am not going to sit by and let us go back to a time where special education students were placed in the basement and not allowed to be educated alongside their non-disabled peers. I am not going to go back to a time where students came to school and didn't get a hot meal or a book or a computer or broadband or all the things they needed to learn. I am not going to go back to a time in the United States of America in 2025, while at the same time in the same press conference that the president was announcing cuts to the Department of Education, that he also announced more funding to the Department of Defense to build helicopters that literally they've already said we don't need. This is not about waste, fraud, and abuse. This is not about downsizing institutions. It's about tax cuts for the wealthiest, most well-connected. It is about raising the debt ceiling. It is about increasing our national debt on the backs of our children. I am so angry is not even the word. It is beyond the pale to think that I sit on two committees on purpose in Congress. The Committee on Education and the Workforce and the Committee on Agriculture. And I asked for the Committee of Agriculture because that's the committee that feeds children. And at the top of their priorities list for things on the chopping blocks are education and food for kids. Why isn't everybody angry about this? Why isn't the media asking that question? Where will these children go? Ask that question.
So let me just, again, I think we can take a little bit of practical wisdom here. As the governor said, call your senator. Call me, but call the senators in red states. Call the senators in blue states. You want to make sure they stand strong, because ultimately there'll be a vote in the Senate. There'll be a vote on the budget in both the House and the Senate on the appropriations measures. We need you to be active, be strong, be loud and clear, and that's going to make a difference in what happens. So you know where we stand, but we need others to stand with us in the Congress. And I'll just say one final point in answer to your very good question about what is the state going to do when we lose this money. That's a good question, but really the question is on the feds, what are you going to do to stop this robbing and stealing of money from our kids and putting it on the backs of the state and local governments, because that's what is happening here, and that's why taxes are going to rise, property taxes are going to rise if schools are kept open.
Final question? I see you.
Yeah, you know, all of the decimation of departments in DC are going to redound upon us. We're going to be paying it. So why are we going to be paying federal taxes? What happens if we don't pay? I think that's like the ultimate, but I'd like to know if we will all be swept away by a great wave if that happens, of probably. My name is Patricia Revel, and I'm from the Invisible Farmington Valley. We're having an education rally in Farmington in front of the schools on April 10th.
I've actually had people ask me that question before, but the state of Connecticut doesn't collect federal taxes. As you all know, the federal government takes that money directly and then sends it back to the state. So we are what you call a donor state, which means we give more to the federal government than we get back. So there really is.
Taxes are subsidized.
Right.
Alabama, Mississippi, and all these red states who don't have enough money in their budgets.
Right. But I think it goes back to the idea. I mean, I was a history teacher, and I taught the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. And in one system, it was every state for themselves, every man for themselves. You know, you just figure it out. And in the other, it was a union of states that took care of each other. So right now, when North Carolina, when the Carolinas have been hit by a storm, federal funds go in and help those communities. When education is at risk, federal funds go in and help those communities. And quite frankly, I'm okay with that. Because for as much as I know that the people here in Connecticut are going to fight hard for the education of the kids here in Connecticut, I care about the education of those kids in deep red Louisiana as well. I care about the education of those kids in the Dakotas and on tribal reservations, because they too are Americans and they deserve it. So for me, this isn't about red states or blue states. It's about humanity and common sense. What good is it if I could feed my children if my neighbor's kids are hungry?
It's nationhood.
And all of these people who think that we need to recede to our own corners and make sure that as long as you're taken care of, you're okay, that is as un-American as it gets. So I am going to literally do everything I can from the state of Connecticut, but also work hard to make sure that my colleagues in other states understand the impact, that their constituents understand the impact. Because when you talk about these things in abstracts, it's okay. But when you talk about it as the speech therapist in the school across the street from your house will no longer be there, then it's a problem. When you start to talk about it as the after-school program that runs in your neighborhood, or the bus that picks up your kid right in front of your door will no longer be able to do that, and you're gonna have to find your own transportation, then people understand the direct impact. So I'm going to fight for all of those kids, not just the kids in the 5th District or the kids in Connecticut, but all of the kids in this country who deserve a shot. And while we're talking about, I hear the president talk about comparing to nations around the world who have made gains in education, nations who have universal public education, universal health care, universal child care, paid family and medical leave, all of the things that kids need for a healthy start to be well positioned to go in school and sit down and learn. So if you really want to have a conversation about the future of education and how we make up for failing test scores and what our next steps should be, it shouldn't be tearing everything down. It should be looking at where the gaps are and standing in intercession in those communities until they can stand on their own. That's what we should be doing. It should be making sure that parents are able to stay home with their kids the first couple weeks of their lives to make sure that they're healthy and have a good start, that they're well nourished and have doctor's appointments and well visits. That's what we should be talking about when we're talking about the future of public education, not getting rid of it completely.
Now you know
Thank
why. Now you know why she was Teacher of the Year. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Education advocates, as well as congressmen and women, coming together to talk about the future of the Department of Education. And coming up at 2 p.m. Eastern, we will hear remarks from President Trump at the White House. So we will be sure to bring that to you from the beginning all the way to the end, right here on Live Now from Fox. All right, everyone, let's take our first break here of the hour. Stay right here with us. Always more to come in just moments on Live Now. Again for joining us on Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Mike Page, as we continue to roll on. Right now, I do want to go out to the Supreme Court. They're hearing a couple of oral arguments today. The first is voting rights and gerrymandering. So let's show this to you a little bit, as we only get audio only from the Supreme Court. So we'll double box it and showcase that President Trump will be speaking at 2 p.m. Eastern right here on Live Now from Fox.
Never have a Section 2 remedial map that fails Jingles 1. That is not geographically compact and does not comply with traditional redistricting criteria. And that's what the district court found here as a matter of fact. We have a factual finding from the district court on that point.
Well, their answer to that, I think, is the 70%. So can you just address that?
Sure. So the 70% does not trump the geographical compactness requirement. I will address that, but I want to make very clear that no matter what, even if you've covered a lot of the old population, you can't draw a non-compact remedial district, and that decides the case. But the other problem is this. First of all, I think the correct number is something like 67%. We looked, but it's over half of the population. And that really matters when you're looking at jingles, because remember, jingles hinges on some very fine calculations. And when you lop off 100,000 black voters in 14 parishes, have to find 100,000 new black voters in another area of the state, you can't just assume that that's substantially related. The 20% issue also, if you go back and look at Shaw 2, the 20% they're talking about is Mecklenburg County. They're talking about the black voter core of that county. The court's referring to 20% of the area of that District 12, but we couldn't tell. We looked for this. You can't, it likely was a much higher percentage of the black voter population of District 12, but it's not in the record, and I've not been able to figure it out.
Counsel, speaking of the record, I have to point to what the appellants point to on page 18 of their brief. This is the state's brief. When they talk about Senator Womack, you've mentioned him several times, and apparently he was asked directly what was the predominant reason for you to create the 6th district this way, the way it looks now, versus just going with Senator Price's bill, which created a more compact district. And he answered, it was strictly politics. Politics drove this map because of the Speaker Johnson, Majority Leader Scalise, and my Congresswoman Julia Letlow predominantly drove this map. And he disavowed that race was the predominant factor. You've said exactly the opposite several times here. So can we just get some clarity on what Womack's position was?
Sure. First of all, Senator Womack said a lot of things. What I quoted from Senator Womack was accurate. But what Senator Womack was doing was distinguishing between the Robinson maps, or whatever one presumed them to be, and the new district. The problem, though, is that this court has never said that there is a second intent analysis done on strict scrutiny. In fact, Justice Kennedy, specifically in Bush v. Vera, said, in response to Justice O'Connor suggesting that that could be the standard, said we've never recognized that, and no case from this court ever has.
Let me put it this way. If Louisiana had accepted the initial Robinson map, would you have brought your litigation? Would you have been able to make the argument that this was not compact, this was somehow a violation, or what would your position have been?
Well, we don't have all the facts in front of us, but we would have scrutinized it, and if the record had been what it was in Robinson so far, we absolutely would have brought the case. And then they would have come into our case and said, well, you know, we think it's compact. We only looked at plan-wide compactness, and that's why we won. I mean, I think we would have prevailed, but
I guess I don't quite understand the role compactness plays in your analysis, because, and this goes back to Justice Kavanaugh's point, that it's really sort of two steps. I mean, once Robinson has provided Louisiana with a good reason to think that there was a Section 2 violation that they needed to remedy by creating another minority district, once that happened, what Louisiana did was look at this map and say, essentially, we have 3 incumbents and we know which 2 are really important for the state to keep. And they created a map that made sure that they kept the 2 incumbents that were most important for the state to keep. And why isn't that completely within the prerogative of a state? That has nothing to do, I mean, it creates a less compact district, no doubt about that. But, we've never said to states, oh, you got to go with compactness when the Speaker of the House is going to be thrown out. I mean, it's totally within the prerogative of the state to say incumbent protection and particular incumbents are really super important to us.
2 responses, Justice Kagan. First of all, we're in strict scrutiny at this point. I mean, the state has racially gerrymandered black and white voters.
But there's 2 steps here. One is there good reason to think there's a Section 2 violation? Robinson has created the premise of thinking that there's good reason, that you need to create another map. Now the question is, What does that map look like? It's the remedial question. It's does the map substantially address the Section 2 violation that you have good reason to think exists? And the state says, you know, the plaintiffs have presented these maps that would substantially address that. We have a better map that would substantially address that, that also allows us to keep our incumbent. Better because it allows us to keep our incumbents. I mean, what's wrong with that?
So
if the state can't do that, the state has no breathing room.
Well, first of all, we disagree with the first premise of the question, but here's, I think, where the problem is. This court is going to have to overrule Shaw 2 and Miller if it holds that you don't have to draw a geographically compact remedial district, because the court in Shaw 2 said, looking at District 12, there's no way we can find that there is a geographically compact population of any population of that district, and that is why that's why they lost in Shaw 2.
I think this is a little bit backwards, Mr. Grime, because you will only get to evaluate CD6 if we find that there was good reason to think that there was a substantial likelihood of a voting rights violation. So that good reason is provided by Robinson, and Robinson says that there's a compact minority population whose Section 2 rights are likely being violated. Once Robinson says that, the question, only becomes whether CD6 substantially addresses that Section 2 violation. But the compactness inquiry, which is is there a compact district such that Section 2 is being violated? That happens at the first step of the analysis, and Robinson has already addressed that question.
Well, but unfortunately, Robinson is addressing a different area of the state. And that's the problem. That's why compactness is a backstop. The other problem is this. In states where you are wringing out the very last elements of black voting population, it's inevitable that whatever the gerrymander is it's finally drawn is probably going to have some fair slice of what was in the original maps. That's why if you only focus on overlap, you're missing the key issue from Shaw 2 and from Miller, which is that you have to have a geographically compact remedial district, full stop. And that's the backstop that keeps us from having to draw lines and figure out how much of Mecklenburg County was really in each district and whether 67% and over half the territory is enough. And again, it matters because these are jingles districts. And all we know is the average for the whole district. We don't even know that the section we're gathering combines with the new voters to satisfy jingles.
Maybe I'm missing the thrust of the question, but the question seems to be, is it not the case that if you grant the premise, then on the remedial, at the remedial phase, anything goes? Now, can that possibly be correct? Suppose that the district that's created is not, the parts of this district are not even connected. You've got an island here, an island there, an island here, an island there. Would that be okay?
Absolutely not, and that's the problem.
Mr. Grime, it is not an anything goes inquiry. We've said it has to substantially address the voting rights population. So, for example, where there was a remedial district that addressed only 20% of the people whose rights were actually violated, we, of course, struck that down. But here, the district addressed 70% of the people whose rights were being violated, which seems like a ways different from 20% and seems to suggest that the voting rights district the voting rights violation was being substantially addressed, which is the only thing we've ever required at that point.
But, well, actually, Justice Kagan, in Shaw 2, the court says that the remedial district must be compact. It must hold a geographically compact population. And, why not just take Shreveport, skip the intermediate territory, and not have it be contiguous, and add that to what is claimed to be the core of this district? Now, again, it was the state's burden to show this in the district court. This argument was never raised in the district court. There was no evidence whatsoever in the record about how many of the people from the original district were in there and whether by combining them with the new populations, we have anything that looks like a jingles district. Because again, their entire argument was the mere existence of Robinson completely satisfy strict scrutiny. That cannot be correct.
Your lead argument in the brief for why there was no compelling interest here in the race-based redistricting on page 36 was the durational point, the Constitution, the authority of a state to engage in race-based redistricting must have an end point. You haven't mentioned that so far. The other side said that that argument's been forfeited, and I want to get your response to that. The fact that you haven't mentioned it so far certainly supports what they're saying on that, but I'll give you a chance to respond.
Sure. I mean, the problem with this case is that we think the appellees win many different ways. And this is an argument we're making on the side of the case that is the state's burden. And so I don't think the law supports that it's our duty to anticipate, second or third or fourth reasons why they'll fail under strict scrutiny and make sure we raise them below. And so I don't think the argument was ours to forfeit. I guess I can put it that way. But the problem is this. If you go back to Robinson, the evidence on current racial context in Louisiana that still requires this purely effect-based test was very thin. They could have actually, in fact, they would have had to have raised that in the district court below, but they never did do that. Again, they didn't bring in any jingles evidence, let alone the kind of evidence that would say, if you look around Louisiana, there are still a lot of barriers to black citizens voting. So that's not on the record. I think there's a reason for that. And I think that shows us that Section 2 is no longer performing the function that it was assigned, that Congress thought it was going to perform back in 1982. Now, why are we seeing so many Section 2 cases? Why are we suddenly now, as voters are becoming more integrated, why are we suddenly finding new Section 2 districts everywhere? I think that's a problem.
Thank you, counsel. Justice Thomas. Justice Barrett. Justice Jackson.
I just have one final question, and it's the Robinson map, the proposed Robinson map that had the black district that would be one that might oust Julia Letlow. Is it your position that the black district drawn in that map was not sufficiently compact?
Your Honor, we think if we have a chance to litigate that, which we would at the remedial phase, assuming that that's raised again, we think we'll be able to show that it's not sufficiently compact, that there are far-flung black communities in northern Louisiana and even in the Delta parishes in Lafayette that don't have very much in common with the more dense population in East Baton Rouge. And I think we'll be able to show it doesn't perform as well, but
thank you.
Not in the record.
Thank you, counsel. Rebuttal, counsel?
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. Just 3 brief points. First, on racial predominance. I would emphasize this court's decision last year in Alexander, where the court emphasized caution that when a federal court says that race was a legislature's predominant purpose in drawing a district, it accuses that legislature of offensive and demeaning conduct. If that caution applies in the ordinary case, respectfully, it should be especially heightened here in a case where 2 Article III courts are telling a state to use race to draw a second majority district. So, Justice Jackson, we don't think the court needs to get to strict scrutiny because race did not predominate under Alexander. Second, on the question of strict scrutiny, my friend talks a lot about Shaw and compactness, but respectfully, my friend ignores footnote 9 of Shaw 2. There in footnote 9 of Shaw 2, this court said that even a plaintiff in a successful Section 2 case does not have a right to be in the ultimate remedial district that is drawn. That's because that footnote emphasizes a state has broad leeway to draw that district. Respectfully, there is no holding in this court's cases that require us to satisfy jingles in drawing the remedial district as we did here. The third point is just one about next steps. With all due respect, we'd rather not be back at the podium this fall defending a new map against a new challenge. This court's cases promise breathing room. We operated in that breathing room in drawing District 6. And if this court holds otherwise, then respectfully, I don't know what this court's voting cases mean. We ask you to reverse. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. The case is submitted.
Right, everyone, you are watching live now from Fox. Oral arguments wrapping up there on the case of gerrymandering. And coming up next, we will be hearing from the Supreme Court. They are going to be doing another hearing here in moments, going to be talking about deportation appeal. That is one of high importance and demand. It will be the argument in Riley versus Bondi, a case about a non-citizen appealing his deportation to Jamaica amid fears of persecution there. So we'll have that and much more coming up in just a little bit on Live Down from Fox. We'll be back in moments. Last week, welcome back to Live Down from Fox. We appreciate everyone continuing to join us all in real time right here. We do want to take you out to the Supreme Court once again. We are just moments away from the Supreme Court hearing oral arguments in Riley versus Bondi, a case about a non-citizen appealing his deportation to Jamaica amid fears of persecution there. So we'll be keeping an eye on this. Let's just continue to listen to some more of the oral arguments.
Premise, Your Honor, A4 does also allow.
Order. Excuse me, a final order.
The statute allows the court to conduct review within 30 days of a final order of removal, but it also clearly says the court has jurisdiction to review a CAT order, as the court explained to Nasrallah already.
Have we ever said that you could do that independent of the final order?
Not independent in the sense, and that is exactly the problem, Your Honor. I think that the sensible approach is to wait until the agency has concluded all of its work, and then you have one petition that encompasses removability, the order of removal, and the CAT questions that are raised.
Does the CAT question then convert the final order into a broader final order by attaching itself to that?
I think what Nasrallah teaches us, certainly, is that it does not convert a CAT order that says that denies CAT relief is not converting the final order into something else, except from the timing of it and what gets.
All right, we will keep an eye on this here for you and get you any big highlights that come about. But we do want to continue on with more live coverage and feeds that are coming in from around the world. Let's go out to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, not in Florida this afternoon. He's actually in Idaho to support a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Let's listen in on Live Now.
And cajole them and try and get them to be more efficient.
I'll be very interested to see that. So with that, Governor.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks, Brad. It's great to be here in Idaho, and I will just say, as somebody that lives in the northern part of Florida now in Tallahassee, this weather's fine. This is not much different than what we've had in the morning. I was expecting colder, so that's really, really great to see. And I would also just like to point out for the record, I've got a son in first grade who's a big prognosticator in terms of football predictions. And for the record, in the college football playoffs, he picked, not successfully, but he picked Boise State to beat Penn State. And he was rooting for Boise State to beat Penn State. But it was cool coming in, being able to see the famed blue field as we were coming in, and to be able to be here with a lot of like-minded folks. I used to say, until someone corrected me, that Florida, since I became governor, has led the nation in economic growth. And a lot of it is because we're comparing New York, California, Illinois, some of those states. And someone said, actually, Idaho has grown a little bit more than Florida over that. So Idaho has had the most GDP growth since 2019. Florida, a close second. And if you look at a lot of the policies that have been done in Idaho, there's a lot of commonality with Florida, universal school choice. They just enacted the death penalty for pedophiles, which we did a couple years ago, and we're eventually going to get the U.S. Supreme Court to reverse a bad decision it made in Kennedy versus Louisiana. They've done great things in the legislature on medical freedom. So I think that there's a lot of really good stuff happening in Idaho. And what brings me here today is I've been supporter of a long time to make some changes to how Congress operates, particularly how they're spending our money. And if you look at when the turn of the 21st century happened, the U.S. debt from 1789, when the Constitution was ratified and the new government took hold, until the year 2000, the U.S. accumulated $5.6 trillion in debt. And even at that time, people were saying that that was a problem. Well, fast forward 25 years, the national debt's now at $36+ trillion. And as a proud conservative and as a proud Republican, I have no problem pointing out the truth that this is both parties in Washington that have created this mess. Much as I'd like to come up here and blame the Democrats, the fact of the matter is it's happened under both parties. The budget that was just passed in the U.S. House of Representatives by the Republicans forecasts the debt to be, in the year 2035, $56 trillion. At what point is this just going to break our country? I think we all know there's a problem. I am convinced that you are not going to have Congress all of a sudden change its behavior for the long term. I think the reason we've gotten in this with respect to fiscal is because there are certain incentives for the people that are in Washington to behave the way they do, and we need to change those incentives. And that involves we, the people in our states, doing what the founding fathers put in the Constitution to propose an amendment to provide some of those constraints on their behavior, in this case, requiring a balanced budget for the U.S. government. Now, I have to balance the budget in Florida. Idaho has to balance the budget. Don't tell me it can't be done. When I became governor in 2019, if you take all the debt in the history of Florida from the 1840s when we became a state that we've accumulated until I became governor, just in my tenure, we've paid off 41% of the state's total debt. Now, that's not just an annual surplus. We run that, but we're actually digging in, taking our surplus, doing tax cuts and other things, but then paying down this debt. By the time my term expires, we will likely have paid down over half of the state's debt that was accumulated over 180 years ago. We had to make tough choices, but part of the reason we were able to do that is because there's never a question that we have to at least balance the budget. So it's either balanced or surplus. We don't have the option to do others, so people understand that, and they're more willing to make really important decisions. So Idaho has an opportunity to certify this proposed amendment under Article 5 of the Constitution. There have been 27 states, including Florida, that have done it. As Governor Little mentioned, I'm going to be going to Montana
and we're going to be meeting with those folks. If Idaho and Montana join the fight, that gets us to 29. There's a couple other states that are on the precipice as well. You need 34 states to trigger Article 5, where you would actually write an amendment and then eventually send to the states for ratification. I don't think it would even get that far. I think if you got to 33 states, I think Congress would see the writing on the wall, and I think they would rush to write an amendment that they would then pass and then send to the states for ratification. Keep in mind, it requires 3/4 of the states to ratify any changes to the Constitution. I'm a small C conservative. I'm a big believer that the Founding Fathers did better than anyone has ever done in devising a plan of government. It's not something that I would do lightly, asking for an amendment to the Constitution. But we can't keep doing the same things up there and all of a sudden just hoping that we're going to get different results. I think we know that this is hardwired to go in a certain direction. And at some point, we the people, have it within our power to choose a different course. And that's what we're here to do, to be able to do. So we had a great meeting with a lot of the legislators. Really great questions. I think people are thinking very deeply about the country's future. But we can sit here and say, oh, Idaho's economy's growing. They're doing this great legislation. Florida's doing all this stuff. And that's great. And when the Biden administration was in, we had to fight them on almost everything to be able to do that. But at some point, the states are not going to even be able to be successful if the federal government just completely goes off the rail with the fiscal. $56 trillion in 10 years. What's the interest on the debt going to look like at that point? I think it'll be really, really problematic as you're seeing it. So we have an opportunity to do something. I think the Founding Fathers understood that wherever the seat of government was going to end up, and they didn't know it was going to be in Washington, D.C. when they did when they did the Constitution, they knew that there would be a danger where we just go off the rails. And they knew they needed to empower the states to be able to take corrective action. So that's really what a balanced budget amendment would do. It would force them to make better decisions and would ultimately avert our country from really having a fiscal collapse. And the final point I'll make is this. The only time in modern history, the last 50 years, where there has been a balanced federal budget was in the late 1990s. And you actually had Bill Clinton was a Democrat president. He came in, he wanted to spend a lot. The voters rejected that. They sent Republicans in 94, and they ended up arriving at a balanced budget at that time. They also were pursuing a balanced budget amendment that failed by 1 vote in the U.S. Senate. Can you imagine if the balanced budget requirement was enacted in the year 2000, how much different our country would be in terms of our fiscal solvency today versus then? How did we go from 5.6 trillion to 36 trillion? So we have an opportunity to act. I commend everyone here in Idaho for the great work they've done across the board. You guys are an example of a state that shows that conservative policies work, common sense works. And I think we're both in the same boat. Like when you do well and your neighboring states do poorly, not really neighboring from us because Georgia, some of those do well, but you've attracted people. And there's some benefits to that. It can help with the economy. There's also challenges, schools, roads, all these things. I mean, I see, talking about Canadians are going to boycott coming to the United States. Not if you travel on the roads in Florida. That's not true. I see these license plates everywhere. And we have a bunch of Canadians. We have other people moving. So it does create challenges. And I'm not anyone that's begged people to move to Florida. And I don't know how Idaho approaches it because a lot of our constituents, there's so many people here. But the reality is people in the United States have the right to vote with their feet. And they have voted with their feet over particularly these last 5 or 6 years. They have fled California, Oregon, and Washington. And they've chosen places like Idaho because they're seeking a better life, just as many people have chosen Florida from even California and Washington, but also New York and Illinois because we do it right. So the common sense policies work. We just need a little dose of common sense up in Washington, D.C. Okay, we're happy to take some questions. Yes?
You mentioned the gravy train. Who's the engineer of the gravy train? Where are the cuts coming?
So here's what I'd say. I think what happens when you go into Washington, D.C., it's a culture that's developed over many decades. And there's a lot of people that have very good intentions. I know a lot of the people up there. I remember when they were running for the first time. They didn't want to be part of a swamp. But what happens is there's just a lot of inertia. This is the way we do business. Like, for example, the way they budget. you can have an agency that gets $10 billion, whether it's successful or not. The next year, the budget starts off at $10 billion plus 7%. They don't even have baseline budgeting. I don't know how they do in Iowa. In Florida, no agency is entitled to anything. You have to justify every single year in the budget, and they don't do that. So it would just change the culture there. They obviously could work out a lot of different things about how to do. I mean, I would just say, you know, you just look at how much money the government was spending prior to COVID, look how much it's spending now. They did not even revert back to pre-COVID levels of spending. I think you could do that. I think there's a lot of things you could do, but one of the things it will do, if they have to balance the budget, look back to World War II. We had a massive debt after, and rightfully so. I mean, it was an existential threat to humanity, and we did the right thing. Massive debt. And then within a couple decades, 3-4 decades, you know, you had that debt lower. Why? Because the economy really boomed. And Congress focused on policies that would help our country advance and the economy to grow. In Florida, we just have to make decisions. You know, you make decisions every year. There was one year, and when COVID hit, my legislature had already done the budget before things really got crazy. And so I waited and held the budget till the end before I acted on it because we didn't know. There was a lot of uncertainty. People were canceling vacations, all these things happening. And I vetoed a lot of money because I said, listen, there's some of my priorities in here I'm vetoing because we don't know. We got them, and it turned out we did very well because we were open and the economy boomed and all that. One year I had to veto 3% of the entire budget. Because it just wasn't the right thing to do for the state. So folks will be able to make those determinations. The people will be able to elect people on certain platforms to be able to work that out. But we have to say that Congress cannot just keep charging to the credit card indefinitely. We're spending more than $1 trillion a year, which is more than we spend on military, to just pay interest on the debt. Just think what happens if you have to refinance that at higher rates. That will balloon. You could be paying $2 trillion just on interest on the debt. So they need to change their behavior, and I don't think they will do it on their own. Yes?
Critics say that apparently uncontrollable process the entire Constitution. Is that a risk that you're comfortable with for a balanced budget amendment?
One, I don't believe that that's accurate. Just think, the Founding Fathers put Article 5 in for a reason. Why would they, one, have put a mechanism to undo what they worked so hard in Philadelphia to create? No, they understood that there'd be a time where the governing class was just insulated from the best interests of the country, and that you would need to have some constitutional reform that didn't require the people or the states to go through that same governing class. And I would remind people, the Constitution was created by the states, and the federal government was created by the states, not the other way around. Second, I don't think it will actually come to that because I really believe history has shown once there's momentum behind this, Congress sees the writing on the wall. I do think they would write an amendment and send it to the states for ratification because they want to be able to control that amendment. And I think states like Idaho and Florida, if it's a good amendment, we'll be happy to ratify. If they play games with it, I'm not going to amend the Constitution lightly. So I think you're going to do that. And I fully expect it to happen. But let's just say you get 34 and you trigger it. I can tell you in Florida, when we did our convention call for this amendment, we have limitations on what the delegates can do. I, as governor, can recall people. I mean, just think about it. If someone in one of our states got up and for a balanced budget amendment convention and they said, well, we really want to look at reining in the Second Amendment, I would have those people on the plane to Tallahassee before they could even get those words out of their mouth. It would not happen. We've even put criminal penalties in for delegates that go wayward. So I don't think that there's a real risk of that because you can take appropriate action to ensure that the subject matter at hand is what is debated. But even if somehow all that didn't work out, you need 38 states to ratify any changes to the Constitution. Is there anybody believing with the majority of states in this country being red states that you would see things like the Second Amendment or some of these things that would be whittled away? There is no way that can pass muster. The only reason I'm a supporter of balanced budget amendment, I'm also a supporter of term limits through this route, but both of those have strong support from the public because people understand that the trajectory is bad fiscally. They also understand Congress should be limited to terms. So there's different reasons to do it. but there's no way any of that stuff could get 38 states to ratify. So I don't think it will come to even going it. I do think Congress will will pass one. Even if you did, there's plenty of ways where you can offer protections to make sure that they're focusing on the task at hand. And keep in mind, when the founders did the original convention in 1787 in Philly, they did it in secret. They met to revise and extend the articles. They went. There was no media. There was no anything. Obviously, different era in terms of digital. There wasn't any of that. But they didn't even have anybody who could write an article and put out a pamphlet. That would not fly nowadays. I mean, obviously, this would be publicly broadcast and everyone would be able to see. It's not like you're just going to go into some convention and burrow in there and no one know what you're doing. So I don't think it's a real risk. And I think the people that say somehow the whole thing would melt down, they're basically saying that the founding fathers were wrong to give the people in the states an ability to restrain the federal Congress. And I don't think they were wrong to do that. I think they understood Congress to be the problem. We met with the legislators earlier, and so you hear a lot of talk about the debt and the fiscal, obviously, as a big problem. You also hear a lot of talk, and I totally agree with this, and I know most of the people in Idaho do, about the growth of the bureaucracy and the administrative state, and how can a bureaucrat be spending tax dollars through USAID to promote transgenderism in Bangladesh? Like, how is that something that could ever be thought of as appropriate? People say it. Even the courts, how judges are issuing these nationwide injunctions to restrain the president from doing really core Article 2 responsibilities, in this case, transporting illegal alien gang members back to their country of origin, or at least El Salvador as a holding area. All of those problems, the root is the fecklessness of the modern Congress. Congress has the power of the purse. They don't have to do continuing resolutions that empower the bureaucracy. They could use the power of the purse to restrain the bureaucracy. They haven't been willing to do it. Congress can limit the jurisdiction of the federal courts. They have plenary authority to do that in the Constitution. They don't do that. I know that they'll complain about when courts do this, but they don't take the action necessary. And then, of course, they've chosen to pile on the debt. So I just think Congress, as an institution, particularly over the last 20 years, has really gone off the rails. And I think the founders understood there would be need for the states to step in and offer some reforms.
To that point, all those concerns, I've been here for a while, gone across my mind, but the absolute desperate nature and the magnitude of it, the minimal risk of what happens if it goes to there. We don't even think we'll get to 34 votes. We think things are going to happen. There's all those sidebars, all those guardrails we can put on those. But then what's the alternative? Do we want our federal debt to go to $70 trillion and consume all of the capital and basically burden our children, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren? I think there is no other usable option, and our forefathers put in the Constitution.
And also, I made the point earlier, it's like, let's just say something popped out that was like really, really bad. Literally, it would take us an afternoon. Like, I could call Brad, I could call GN40, I'd call Kemp, I can call these governors and say, this is bad. We'd put out a thing saying, with our legislative leader saying no, and it would die. Like, immediately, we would be able to rally 13 states. So I think the risk is so infinitesimally small compared to what Governor Little points out, the big risk of continuing on our current course and what that means for the country.
Governor, when you spoke to Idaho lawmakers this morning, what type of conversation you have really to convince people in the room that might have criticized?
I'm not sure about that, but I think the questions were excellent. I mean, these are clearly legislators that are thinking very deeply, not just about the issues confronting Idaho, but the future of the country. And, I think we're in similar boats, just like our states have had success. That's great. But we're all Americans here, and we want the country to succeed. And I've got I have a 4, 6, and an 8-year-old at home. I know most of the legislators have kids and grandkids. You start thinking about, what does that future look like 20 years from, what are we going to be, 75 trillion in debt? How do you square this circle? And so I just think people are really concerned about the future of the country. I think they asked all the right questions. I think they're thinking very, very deeply about it. And I do think the fact, like, if you just had the balanced budget vote separately, seems like there would be probably more support than the package that wasn't able to get the votes the other day. Yes.
Also promise of Doge, and then perfect example is you tried to give $1 billion, almost $1 billion back to the federal government, and couldn't even figure out how to do it. Now you met with Elon Musk, it's going to happen. Talk about the promise of Doge and just that example of how messed up things have become.
So just for what he's referring to, during the Biden administration, we rejected federal funds on a variety of things because they had strings attached. So some of the road funding, we had to do all the DEI and woke policies, which are totally contrary to our state's policy. We had kind of led the fight against that stuff. Now it's more fashionable to be against it. When we were doing it, we were kind of having an uphill battle. So we did it, and we told the Department of Transportation and the Biden administration, here's $350 million or however much it is. We're not using it. And they're like, we don't know how to take it back. They literally did not know how to take back the money. Same thing on refugee money to send back, I believe, to HHS. They didn't do. So I'm like sitting on almost $900 million. We're not going to accept it because we're not going to change our behavior. So let's send it back and be part of the Doge efforts. So we went up and met with Elon on Friday in Washington, and he had one of his lieutenants there, and they were just like, you want to give back money? Like, yeah, we'll accept it. They got on the phone to Treasury. And like within like 30 minutes, we had a plan to do it. And so we have initiated that. And so what's the promise of Doge generally? I think there's a lot of promise. I think when you see some of the spending that's happened, nobody justifies some of the grants that have been going out on some of these things. It was clearly taking taxpayer money and using it to push an ideological agenda. It was not about serving the interests of the country or what's in the public's interest. It was an ideological niche interest. And basically, these agencies had been taken captive by this viewpoint and used your money for that. So I think it's been great to expose. Here, I think, is the challenge, though. We're here talking about a balanced budget amendment because Congress won't change its behavior. Elon, and they're using a lot of savvy tech and all this